came hurrying down to the path, seized Workus' hand, covered it with kisses, tried to drag him from his horse, and failing in this began tugging at the reins. Workus was embarrassed, particularly about the hand kissing. "I guess we'll have to stop for 5 minutes," he said, so we dismounted and followed the old woman to the house. It was another homemade mill, primitive as the one below, except that it was driven by a shiny little gasoline engine of American make. The old woman gave us coffee and lamented that Jules Narcissus, apparently her son, had missed our visit. When we left, she tried to kiss Workus' hand again. "Are they all like that toward you?" I asked him. "No, no," said Workus, annoyed. "I gave her son a little help once and she can't seem to forget it. She's getting old." It was from the son, Jules Narcissus, on a subsequent occasion and Workus not present, that I learned the story of the 2 mills. 3 times in 3 successive rainy seasons, torrents had wrecked the mill below, and he was prepared to give up when Workus advised him to borrow money, bring an engine over from the mainland, and put his mill up on the hillside. Narcissus had a brother who believed himself to be a mason and who professed complete ability to set the engine. But he built the concrete base out of true, and the belt kept flying off, so they went in despair to Workus, wailing that the American engine was no good, and Workus went up to take a look. It was terrifiant. "Monsieur," Narcissus told me, "it was terrifiant what the lieutenant said and did. My brother and I fled from his curses and observed him from the door. He seized a crowbar and we thought he would destroy the engine, but he smashed only its base, and then he went away telling us nothing, heaping on our heads awful curses. But, monsieur," he returned, "on that self-same day he returned, and he had taken off his uniform as when he works upon the boat." I-82 TILS winding behind him came men bearing new bags of cement on their heads, and in his hand there were tools, a trowel, and monsieur with his own hands he set that engine true, as you behold it now. These details I learned later, but on the trail that morning I suspected that something of the sort was behind the old woman's gratitude, for other illuminating episodes occurred. After climbing slowly upward, partly through rising jungles and partly along rocky mountain slopes, to an altitude of nearly 3,000 feet, we crossed over a range and found ourselves on a wide fertile central plateau, called the Plain Mapu, with a higher range rising beyond it. It was covered with gardens, small farms and habitations. Across this plain, then turning northward, following its length we galloped. Extraordinary as it may seem, no accurate map of the interior of this island has ever been published. None exists or ever has existed except the crude maps made by Workus. All the old Spanish maps and all the French maps, old and modern, show its location and coastline with admirable accuracy, and some of them show its principal coast villages. But the interior appears mountainous, uninhabited, untrailed, its mountains rising to a central backbone range. The fact that there are 2 parallel ranges instead of one, with this fertile high plateau between them, is neglected by the professional cartographers. On French maps around 1850, in the northwestern interior of the island, the name of a town or village, Dankville, begins to appear. The part of the island where that town is placed on the maps is a barren, absolutely waterless, thorny desert. No village or habitation has ever existed there within the memory or tradition of the islanders. No village named Danville within their memory or tradition has ever existed anywhere. It is as if some whimsical old map maker, tired of seeing La Gonave blank, had inserted it gratuitously. There are villages in the interior of the island, but Danville seems to have been a myth. Concerning water, the geological textbooks on Haiti copy each other, including a recent American one, in asserting that there are only 3 or 4 practical springs on the island, and that it has no stream which empties into the sea. Workus has listed 26 clear-flowing and abundant springs, 18 of which he eventually showed me, and the very stream up which we had come from ants empties into the sea at Magazine. The maps made during the last 10 years by the American-administered Travaux Publiques are coastally correct for La Gonave, but show most of its interior as still terra incognita. The White King of LAGONAVE 183, at some of the little farms on the Plain Mapu we stopped, or rather were stopped. One man insisted on showing Workus some baby pigs. I got that tale also later. Workus had found scrawny runted razorbacks on the island. He had persuaded the American agricultural station at Jackmill to give him a blooded boar and brood sow. He had presented them as a gift to a certain dependable Gros Nègre in the mountains, with the understanding that the Gros Nègre must in turn give away all the first litter, After that the pair and its further progeny belonged to the owner. Each person who got one of the litter must in turn cross it with the Razorbacks and give away all of that first brood. So by now, without expense or exchange of money, this new blood was scattering all over the island and everybody benefiting. At another place we stopped, it was the same story over again, this time about melons. 3/4 of the seeds of the first crop had to be given away. You could give them to your brother or cousins if you wanted to, but you had to give them away. There is much to be said for despotism as a form of government. Workus was tyrannical. I began to understand why these peasants looked up to him as a sort of god almighty. It was in the plain Mapu that we turned aside to see a certain Gros Nigger, a rich, swaggering peasant named Alliance Laurent, who Workus had learned was infringing on the land of neighbours. With many wives and concubines, he strutted like a proud rooster surrounded by his hens. Workus smiled like a benevolent crocodile on Laurent, took his outstretched hand, fired a string of compliments among his women, and began congratulating Laurent on his handsome breeches and boots. "You know, Laurent," he said, "why it gives me such pleasure to see you in fine health and fine garments." Laurent gaped. "Because it will add to the joy of the girls and women at Ansegalitz when they see you marching barefoot in TILS winding 184 monkey clothes stripes, carrying water all day long on your head for my shower bath." Not a word had been spoken about the infringement of land rights, but we weren't a mile along the trail when a terrified and humble Laurent came galloping after us, promising to restore all he had taken. We saw a woman Workus had sent over to the mainland for a double cataract operation. She hadn't wanted to go, she had been afraid. He made her go. He made a boatman down at Pointeracket take her. She had come back seeing, she thought he was God Almighty, and so it went. As we galloped back down to Ants, it was getting plainer and plainer why they feared and admired him, but I was beginning to wonder about the King Busy-ness. Eventually curiosity got the better of me and I asked him about it, what there was to it, whether it was true. He seemed embarrassed again. He said, well, yes, there was something to it. One of these days he'd tell me all about it, and since I seemed to be interested in the island, we'd make another trip up soon, up to the top of Bois Noir, and see the Black Queen. This was the first I'd heard of a Black Queen. I don't think Workus realized how startling it sounded. Chapter II. The Black Queens caught the night before our projected journey up to Bois Noir to visit the Black Queen, T-Memin. Workus told me the story of how he had been crowned King of Largonave. Coming to the island 4 years before, he had set about a thorough exploration of its interior. From peasants who came down to the coast, he had heard that in Bois Noir, in a forest on a mountain top, in the almost exact geographical centre of the island, there dwelt an old black woman who had ruled for more than 30 years. In her compound, they said, was a drum taller than a man, so that the drummers had to stand on a raised platform to boom out the signals for the convocations of her court. She had prime ministers, they told him, a cabinet and an army. He hadn't quite believed it, he said, but he had gone up, alone, unarmed and friendly, I gathered, to see what it was all about. The old woman had proudly welcomed him and set the drum booming. In an hour or two, processions of Negroes, men and women, blowing conch shells, beating work drums, waving flags, armed with machetes, began arriving, until there were several hundred in her compound. She introduced him to an old man who was 7 Nimster Vinti Muir, others who were 7 Ninister Vagriculture, 77 Imister Largera P, etc. Workus remained there. He spent almost the entire first day in conference with them. They talked and talked and talked. Also they sent for the old blind soothsayer. What they really had, he discovered, was a sort of agricultural guild, primitive yet highly organized. In planting, I-86 TILS winding times and harvest in times for clearing new ground, they went about in little armies, 50 or 100 to a group, and did the work communistically. They had been organized that way forever back in the mountains, one of the old men told him. And the queen with her council and court preserved order among them, settled disputes, dispensed justice. It seemed to me as he told it that he was describing a sort of primitive monarchical communism. The present Queen T-Memin had ruled for a generation. Before her there had been a queen called La Rianita Hazard who had reigned from time immemorial. The more Workus listened to this, he told me, the more he liked it. It sounded good to him, he said. Why bust it up, let it ride a while and see how it worked out. So he made a speech to the assembly. He told them he had been sent over with Author Iti from the mainland and confirmed the Queen T-Memin in power. As for his part, he would stay on the island to supervise everything and help them. When T. Memin needed advice, he told her, let her send a messenger down to answer Galitz, and he would ride up for conference. He didn't know how it was going to work out, but he thought he'd give it a trial. Well, a week later they had sent for him, and when he arrived they waved flags over his head. It seems the old soothsayer had been meanwhile consulted, strewed flowers and palm branches in his path, put a big yellow silk bandana over his shoulders, set him in a chair and carried him round and round in a circle, singing, and knelt before him, and laid machetes upon his shoulders. A lot of stuff like that, he said, and crowned him king of Largonave. Lai had seen a certain humorous element in it naturally. He grinned as he told me the details, but they took it, he said, damned seriously. Just how seriously they took it he hadn't realized until some weeks later when he had started building a stone wharf at Ants. It was in January, and he had estimated. The Black Queeness caught 187 that with a dozen men working steadily, he ought to get it finished by May. One morning, he said, he was awakened by an ungodly noise, and into Ants poured the Queen T. Memin's army down from the mountains, 500 of them, beating their drums, blowing their conch shells, howling, followed by their women, donkeys laden with great panniers of food and iron cook-pots. Flags were planted in the clearing before his house. The old minister Largera shouted commands, and there they pitched camp. There were even dogs and chickens, he said, and pigs. Workers stood watching this from his front door, he told me, thinking, what the hell? He went back into the house, he said, and put on his belt with his .45 automatic. He said he also put on his lieutenant's helmet. He had seen his 6 gendarmes out there, standing off at a distance, gaping like sheep. It was the first, last, and only time he had ever packed a gun, he said, in his whole 4 years at Largonave. Workers talked well when once he got started. He said he was so surprised at this eruption that the thought of his stone wharf never entered his head. The minister Largera, escorted by flags, came over to see him and explained. In exactly 4 days, Workers told me, they had the stone wharf built, completed, finished. They wouldn't take pay from him, they wouldn't take gifts, they wouldn't even take food or permit help from his village. They were high-handed. And when they had finished they broke camp, came and marched 3 times around his house, waving their flags and singing a song about him, and went back to the mountain. Hot damn, said Workers, grinning. He grinned in memory over it, of what a fool he'd been to put on his belt, and of how they'd got his stone wharf finished in 4 days. He guessed that was about the whole story of how they'd made him a king, except, well, you know these Haitians, the ones back in the bush, they're superstitious about everything, and some of the old ones had. I-88 TILS, winding the notion that he'd been sent. Well, that was all right, he had been sent, said he, by orders of the U.S. Marine Corps. We got talking about the peasants. They're a funny lot, he said. You think they're simple, they're easy enough to handle, but you think you know everything that's going on in their heads, and then you find out that you don't know a damned thing about them. We arrived at Queen T. Memin's habitation earlier than she had expected us. She was busily engaged in supervising the royal baking for the festivities that would be held in our honor that night. She was a huge, squat negress, past 50, solid bulk rather than fat, with a big, heavy head and heavy but not gross features. In physiognomy, except for her blackness and sex, she resembled a certain type of American demagogue politician. She looked capable, but not lovable. When we rode into the compound, she was seated on a low stool under a palm canopy, imperiously shouting orders in a hoarse, deep voice and munching a stalk of sugar cane. She was clothed in a checkered Mother Hubbard and a blue bandana. She wore bracelets and earrings. She was barefooted. She heaved herself up and waddled to greet us as we dismounted. She was very respectful and friendly to Workers, but there was no ceremony about it, either on his part or hers. The ceremonies, titles, formalities, and obeisances, I gathered, were confined entirely to the formal convocations and assemblies. She shouted commands about the care of our horses, water and food for them and us. There must have been a dozen people there to serve her, hired servants and relatives, I judged, ranging in age from naked brats to crones. She was a widow and boss of her own household as well as a queen. After seeing that we were comfort-able and food spread before us, she returned to her stool under the canopy and resumed direction of the baking. There was something Alice in Wonderland about her. The Black Queeness caught 189 bulk in her baking, her scowling, imperious face, with gingerbread cookies and cassava cakes, more than a bushel of them already piled on a blanket before her, and others coming on trays from the oven. There was something decidedly Alice in Wonderland about the stalk of sugar cane she was chewing. It was golden in the sunlight, and you could half shut your eyes and imagine that the queen was angrily munching her scepter. Through an open door we could see big flaps of dough being cut up by 3 girls. On another table, dough was being kneaded, and on another white flour was spread. Outside, under a smaller tunnel, the cassava cakes were being baked by an old man and 2 boys. A 5-foot circular sheet of heavy iron was raised slightly from the ground with hot embers beneath it, a gigantic pancake gridiron. The gingerbread was being carried on trays to an oven cut out of a limestone hillside. The old woman who tended it, pushing the trays far in with a long pole, had built a shelter of banana leaves against the sun. Workus took me to see the big drum which stood upright beneath a tree. It was a monster as tom-toms go, but nothing of that sort is ever quite as big as you expect it to be, not even a whale or the Woolworth Tower or the Olympic. This drum, a cylinder hollowed from a tree trunk with a head of bull's hide, was just a few inches taller than a man. I was disappointed. I had thought it was going to be at least 10 feet high. It was beaten, Workus told me, with the 2 fists, and the man had to stand on a platform when he beat it. This somewhat assuaged my disappointment. After all, it was a monster. I hadn't felt drawn toward Queen T. Memin. I didn't find her sympathetic. When Workus asked her to let me photograph her while there was still plenty of sunlight, I became slightly annoyed with her. She insisted on dressing first, and I wanted her the way she was. She went into one of the houses, yelled for maidservants, and presently Igo Trails Winding emerged with a white muslin, stored dress, stockings and black patent leather shoes. She had taken off her bandana and smeared her black cheeks with powder. It took Workus HVE minutes, at my request, to persuade her to wind another turban around her head. When we posed her in a chair, on a mat, with Workus in another chair by her side, she yelled to one of the girls to run into the house for the wooden baton which was her scepter. I was beginning to respect her if I didn't like her. She was a person, and a strong-acted person. As I was about to press the camera shutter, she felt something still lacking to her dignity and emitted another hoarse yell, this time for the drapeau. A young girl came, bubbling with interest but a little afraid of the camera, and knelt with the flag before her. T. Memin, who had had some previous experience of being photographed since the advent of Workus, considered the matter and noted that the girl and the flag would obscure the glory of her patent leather shoes. With a well-directed kick in the bunda, she toppled the girl over and ordered her to kneel at the left. Then she patted her on the head to show that she wasn't angry, and finally I got the picture. I decided that queens are the way they are. They are not like presidents. They don't have to put on cowboy hats and shake hands and smile sourly and say they owed it all to their mothers. I mentally apologized to her for not liking her. I didn't say anything to Workus about it at all. I was wrong anyway. If she had proved to be something like a black tribal queen in an African tom-tom movie, I suppose I should have been enchanted with the theatricality. When, instead of that, she had turned out to be a real and somewhat surly, strong-headed person, it had annoyed me. Workus and I went down the mountainside to see if we could shoot a few wild pigeons for her. The events of the evening were sufficiently dramatic. I forgot all about T. Memin's patent leather shoes and the powder on her cheeks when that monster drum began to SSC page 20I, he had to whip her once or twice a year. The Black Queeness caught 191 boom. Toward dusk, up from the narrow, winding footpaths came processions of Negroes, headed by women bearing flags, singing drapeau, drapeau/drapeau/, and men blowing conch shells. As some of the processions arrived and ceased their noise, we could hear others approaching a half-mile distant down the mountainside. The flag-bearers, always women and usually the handsomest wenches, were tall, upstanding, barefooted, their bodies covered only by thin, faded cotton shifts, which moulded to their high breasts and powerful buttocks as they moved. They wore icily brilliant red, yellow and sapphire bandana head cloths, gold earrings, and necklaces of coral and glass beads. All the flags, as the different groups arrived, were stuck horizontally in the thatch roofing of the big peristyle under which the convocation was to take place. The royal orchestra consisted of 3 drums, a wooden box on which a man rat-a-tatted lustily with 2 sticks, and a rattle cha-cha made with pebbles in a canister. King Workus and Queen T. Memin sat on a raised platform behind the drums. On his head was a high crown of yellow feathers with little pieces of mirror sewn in, as they are frequently sewn on Hindu tapestries, glittering in the torchlight like rhinestones or diamonds. Workus would never let me photograph him with this crown on his head. He felt that if it were published, it might make him seem ridiculous back home. As a matter of fact, It was not ridiculous in that setting, as he sat there, blond, square-jawed and soberly competent. It wasn't a joke he was lending himself to. These natives took themselves and him seriously. With some of the groups that arrived were the presidents and ministers of various allied Congo societies, the Belle Étoile, Fleur de Jeunesse, Réserve la Famille Saint Trinite. The presidents were old men chiefly. This is a sound diminutive word of African origin. In Creole it has save iral meanings. It means a tin can or gourd with pebbles rattling in it. It means also a woman's clacking tongue, also a kind of locust tree whose dry pods rattle when stirred by the breeze. 192 TILS winding also minor queens. Each society had one. Their names were shouted out as they arrived, and some of them were nice names. I remember a venerable old man called Augustin Tranquil, and a woman who was La Réunie Macely. As these special personages arrived, they were escorted into the peristyle with their groups, flag girls holding the flags of their societies crossed over their heads. These flags were of various colours, some cotton and some silk. The flag of the Societe Belle Étoile was of blue silk with white rosettes sewn on it and streamers of orange. The flag of another society was red with 3 inverted V's in black. As a queen or president was marched into the peristyle, the drums would beat out the special rhythm of that society as they marched circling 3 times around, then stopped before the drums. If the personage was a man, he stood to salute, swinging off his hat and holding it straight out at arm's length before him. If a woman, she dropped to one knee in a sort of kneeling curtsy. When various of these had arrived and made obeisance, Queen T. Memin's own master of ceremonies, armed with a long baton, took charge, assembling before the drums the flag women and officials of T. Memin's own court. This is what he shouted as they assembled. Attentional le royal le royal le royal. Hellel 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 was shouted by the crowd with a short rat-a-tat salvo on the drums. Attentional la Rionel la Rionel la Rionel. Hellel hellel hellel. Another drum salvo. General la Placel, Adjutant la Place, I President en Chef, I Minister la Guerra, I Minister V'Interior, Minister Agriculture, I. 193 The Black Queeness caught Helloel Hellel Lielwa salvo. Ha Rioni Chanteuse, La Rioni Victoria, Ha Rioni Drapau, Confiance la Rioni. Helloi helloi helloi, final salvo. A pale yellow silk bandana scarf was handed to Queen T. Memin, who knotted it around King Workus Shaul Deyas. 4 big Negroes mounted the throne, and lifting up the chair in which King Workus was seated, marched with him 3 times around the peristyle, as the Pope is carried in St. Peter S., and then around in circles through the crowd outside it, the people falling in behind, shouting, waving flags, blowing conch shells. And this ended the formal ceremony. A dance, congo and feasting followed, which lasted through the night. There is a point scarcely necessary to state, but which I promised Workus I would set down in so many plain words so that nobody could misunderstand. Workus, though king of the island, is not married to the queen. He is not married to anybody. Chapter III. A torn scrap of paper. When my city Haitian friends had learned that I was going over to live for a while with Workus on La Gonave, they said, Tynes, Teinsel, as if I had announced a voyage to the North Pole or the moon. Why La Gonave remains so isolated, although close and in plain sight, requires explaining. There are thousands of fine automobiles in Port-au-Prince, but there is not a single launch motor boat or power boat, not a single sailing pleasure craft privately owned, either among the rich natives or in the American colony. When I wanted to go to La Gonave, for instance, there were just 2 ways to get there. Fly by military plane, or knock about in the bay from 10 to 30 hours in one of the primitive tubs of some peasant fisherman or some island boatman who had come in with cotton or other produce. Furthermore, there is no reason to go except curiosity. Consequently, La Gonave is the subject of fantastic speculation, and around it queer rumours and legends grow. As in the case of the Black Queen who ruled on a mountain top and the coronation of King Workus, these stories sometimes have a basis in fact. There is the tale of a great cave beneath the mountains, the tale also of a bottomless pool in which dwells a sacred crocodile that no one dares to kill, a tale also that at Pygmy is buried a great chest of gold, rubies and diamonds. Hidden since writing this, I am told that Christian Gross has bought a sloop, and I believe the Marine Corps has acquired a sea sled, in addition to the High Commissioner's barge. A torn scrap of paper 195 there by the Indian Queen Annacona who was hanged by the Spaniards. A fresh mystery, leading to an unforeseen solution, developed while I was living on the island with workers. One morning as we were at breakfast, old Tonton Zo, captain of a fishing boat which occasionally transporting messages to and from the mainland, appeared with a soiled, week-old letter to workers from gendarmerie headquarters. It was official. It said that the newspapers in Port-au-Prince were full of a story to the effect that the tomb of the lost dauphin of France, the son of Louis XVI, had been discovered near the village of Zédetroits on La Gonave. The information was specific. A grotto concealing a small natural basin, having a rock on which is an iron plate on which is written, Pour la tranquillite de notre rôle nous vavons infirme id, and, of course, it was added, inevitably in the newspapers, that treasures were buried with him. Clippings from the newspapers were enclosed. Workers suspected it was a deliberate hoax, but the letter was an official order demanding an investigation. We went to Zédetroits, a god-forsaken mud village 3 hours up the coast, where he had 2 black gendarmes permanently stationed. Nobody, of course, had ever heard of any ancient tomb. Workers said to the 2 gendarmes, "I think this is all blague, but I want you to keep at it and find out for me if there is, or ever has been, any such thing as an old iron plate with writing on it in this part of the island." News of the result of that search reached us ahead of the gendarmes. There was great excitement among the natives. A man came riding into Ants, shouting that the tomb had been found. Later in the afternoon, one of the 2, it is a historical fact that Anacona with her court and dancing girls used to come over from Liagain in long canoes to bathe in the pool beneath the waterfall. People often talk of making a syndicate to go over and dig for the treasure. Treasure hunting is a favorite occupation of Haitians, high and low. Sometimes it is successful. Treasures were buried by the buccaneers and by fleeing colonial slave owners. Trails winding 196 gendarmes came down by boat, triumphantly excited, with a heavy package wrapped up in gunny sacking. He had found the plate with writing on it, and had conceived it his duty to rip the thing out of the rock with crowbars, and here it was. We opened it, somewhat sharing his excitement. It was a circular bronze plaque which had been cemented into the rock by the geodetic surveying crew of the United States destroyer Eagle in 1919, marked with the altitude, latitude, and longitude, and used as a triangulation point against mountaintops across the bay. It was a handsome thing. Engraved around these useful scientific data in a circle was the lettering, République de Haiti, Défense de Toucher. Apparently illiterate peasants coming on the plaque set in the lonely rock had invented a legend that a Roy was buried there. The legend had spread to the mainland, and the Port-au-Prince journalists had done the rest. The sacred crocodile, however, turned out to be no hoax. He was real. His is still alive, I believe. He lives in a pool near Zédabricots in the interior and occasionally drags under and devours a pig or a calf which comes there to drink, but the natives are afraid to let him be shot and even sometimes provide food for him. He has been there from beyond the memory of man and perhaps incarnates one of their misters. Workus respects their wishes. He is also wisely tolerant in other matters. Workus is no reformer. He doesn't trouble himself, for instance, about the almost universal polygamy on the island. He took me to see a tall buck named Charlemont whom he had made a police rural. Charlemont had begun as a barefoot vagabond, working in other people's fields. No woman would have him. After he became prosperous, he courted one who had scorned him in the days of his poverty, made her his mistress, and then kicked her out. Charlemont had a way. A torn scrap of paper 197 with women, and now when we went to see him he was surrounded by a harem. They worked in the fields for him and ministered to his comfort. He was like a barnyard cock. Another Gros nigger named Ert was married to 3 sisters. There is also occasional polyandry on the island, that is, real, primitive polyandry, which is different from either promiscuity or variety. A case of this sort came to our attention in connection with something I have found among my pencil notes of the La Gonave period, at the top of which I seem to have scribbled, idyllic episode among the mangroves. Beneath it is a transcription of a short report written in extremely bad French by one of the few of Workus gendarmes who was able to write French at all. Registered, freely translated, it reads, Village of the Big Mangroves, March 29, 1927. Lieutenant Workus, commander of the island of La Gonave, I send you in the custody of Gendarme André Maurice 2 good-for-nothings, vagabonds. They amuse themselves all day long with a bamboo flute of the sort called vaccine. They dance and sing, and that's all they do. My respects, your devoted soldier, signed Jean Baptiste. P.S. Behold also a girl named Lovelier who was with these two vagabonds, and who vociferated words prejudicial to the gendarmerie, without cause. Registered Gros Mangles, 29 Mars 1927 Loot. Workers commandant de Alsle de Gonave qui vous expédie sous la conduite de gendarme André Maurice Dews, persons de gens sans avieux. Us a jout out la journée avec un bambou, comme sous nom de vaccin, ils fait danser rara et chanter sans rien faire. Mes respects votre soldat devout Jean-Baptiste Voissai, et mes femme de la nommée Lovelier, qui était avec caste du vagabonds, et qui vocifère de paroles au préjudice de la gendarmerie sans cause. TRILS Winding 198, the gendarme André bearing these dreadful accusations brought his 3 prisoners down from Gros Mangles on a fishing boat, and waded ashore with them at Ants, across the coral reefs. The letter sounded more like a page from the pastorals of Theocritus than it did a criminal accuser Tion. I wandered from what little paradise beneath the coconut trees, where 2 young men and a girl played the flute and sang and danced all day long. The gendarme must have dragged them. None of the 3 seemed more than 20 or 21. The 2 youths were scared and sulky. The girl Lovelier, a handsome, slender wench, was still vociferating. Workus fired a string of amusing compliments at her in low Creole, and told her to shut up or he'd give her 10 years in prison. She stuck out her tongue at him and obeyed. André had confiscated and brought with him as Exhibit A the bamboo flute. It was of noble proportions, several inches in diameter and more than 2 feet long. After their names and the charges were inscribed in the register, we took them out under a tree, making André bring the flute. The 2 young men were at first suspicious and unwilling, but Lovelier, threatening to slap the face of one of them, forced them to acquiesce, and once started, they might have been going still if we hadn't said enough. The flute emitted rich, soulful mooings, the second man tapped with sticks and sang, while Lovelier danced the cancan like a black Salome. There is a misdemeanor law in Haiti, seldom enforced, against vagabondage, and another against vituperating gendarmes in uniform, so Workus sent for the old Ants justice of the peace to sift the matter. André testified against them, saying that the 2 youths were notorious for never working, had no occupation and no visible means of support, and as for the girl, she had screamed curses at him when he arrested them, so he had arrested her too. But this scarcely made sense. Gendarmes do not arrest people. A torn scrap of paper 199 for not working in Haiti, not even on the mainland, much less on La Gonave. The men were frightened still, inarticulate in their defense, but Lovelier was voluble and illuminating. The 2 weren't vagabonds, she said, she supported them, she provided for them, and they didn't need to work. Was one of them her man? By en seul they both were. They were établis with her. The whole trouble was, she said, that Jean-Baptiste, the other gendarme, was building himself a new house at Gros Mangles, had tried high-handedly to impound her 2 men to do the clissage, withing. It not being needful for them to labour, they had refused, and Jean-Baptiste in revenge had them arrested. Why hadn't Jean-Baptiste come down? Because he was afraid, said she, sticking out her tongue at André. André, browbeaten a bit, admitted on cross-questioning that there was some truth in this, but said Jean-Baptiste had offered to pay them for their work so that it was regular. Liar, shouted Lovelier, he didn't offer to pay, who ever heard of a gendarme paying, and if he had they didn't have to do it for him. Lovelier was asked about cursing the gendarme, about the words she had vociferated prejudicial to the gendarmerie. Absolutely not. She had not cursed at all, and she had said nothing prejudicial to the gendarmerie, for which she had great respect, only this André oughtn't to be in it. Well, what had she said to André? She would willingly repeat it, for it was the truth. She had said that André was a whoremonger, a robber, a petty thief. He had the yaws as well as a number of other vile diseases, and he wanted to go to bed with her. Those were personal matters, said she, which had nothing to do with the gendarmerie. Lovelier was a smart one. André was beginning to realize that he had made a mistake in adding her to his prisoners. He became confused. He hadn't anticipated all this investigation and cross-questioning over so trivial a matter. He and Jean-Baptiste were due for a severe reprimand, if nothing worse. 200 TILS Winding, and presently Lovelier departed triumphantly with her 2 men, also with the bamboo flute. I hope they are still dancing and singing all day long beneath the palm trees, and I suspect that they probably are. Workus is not a missionary. I felt often on La Gonave as if he and I were a couple of Robinson Crusoes. It had become familiar to him after 4 years, but we occasionally discovered things that were new even to Workus. The northwestern end of the island is a desert of thorn bushes without springs, almost wholly uninhabited. One day, as Workus and I were riding through it, planning to come out at Traului on the coast, where there is a collection of fishing huts, and where we could find water which the inhabitants carried from a brackish well some miles south of the village on the hills, we lost our way and emerged at a point on the barren coast north of Traului. As we followed the coast, we saw a man and a donkey wad-ing out into the Atlantic Ocean where there was a flat, low shelving beach. The donkey was laden with a double sack pail. We saw them start briskly, the man leading the donkey as if they were planning to wade across to Cuba, and out of curiosity we rowed down to the beach to see what they were about. Workus suddenly shouted at me, "Do you see what I see? Have they gone crazy, or are we crazy?" The man and the donkey were knee-deep in the rippling incoming tide about 50 yards from the shore. The donkey had his nose in the water and was apparently drinking his fill, while the man was scooping water up in his straw hat and drinking it out of the salty ocean. Workus shouted to him, "Caro Faisla, oh foo, oh vi Mary. What are you doing there? Have you gone cuckoo? Do you want to kill yourself?" The man raised himself up, waved his hat, grinned and called out, "Bonjour / Blanc, oh Gagnon Soif, Vinny Lee Empile Douse. Hello white man, are you thirsty? Come on, it is sweet." A torn scrap of paper 201. Meanwhile, we had ridden out through the shallow water to where he was. The donkey was still sucking up long draughts of what seemed to be ocean water, and we got down and scooped up some of it in our hands and tasted it. It was slightly brackish, but good fresh water just the same, bubbling up through the sand over a space that must have been 20 or 30 feet in diameter. It was a big submarine spring of sweet water. The man said that they had found it from seeing the wild cattle come there to drink, and that they had caught or killed dozens of them there until the wild cattle no longer came, but that all the people who crossed that way knew of this spring and preferred it to the water at Traului. Seeing this Negro and his donkey drinking from the salty ocean was one of the memorable experiences I had on La Gonave. Before we learned the explanation, it had already crystallized itself as one of the pictures which do not occur except in dreams, like seeing a man with 3 heads, or like floating in the air, or entering a crowded ballroom naked. But there was another thing on La Gonave that seemed to me to contain an even stronger element of the fantastic. Its explanation was simple. Indeed, it required none, yet it never ceased to affect me with a feeling that some queer influence was at work. I am wondering now if it may not convey a clearer impression of what La Gonave was really like than anything else I have written or will write. Perhaps there will be many readers to whom it will mean nothing at all, who will wonder in their turns why I have so much as mentioned it. It was merely a matter of scraps of old newspaper, some of them several years old, some of them comparatively recent, sometimes rain-soaked and rotting beside a jungle trail where no one had passed for months, sometimes pasted on the mud wall of a thatched hut in the mountains, sometimes yellow and wind-blown in the Hajon Desert, sometimes wrapped round 2 cents. 202 tils winding worth of dried fish sold by an old woman down at Pickme. Now, a yellowed scrap of newspaper, particularly when it is years old, and fluttering in the wind or rotting in a forest, should be a scrap of any old newspaper. Pick one up at random in Central Park or Central China, and it may be anything. But on this West Indian island, with its 500 square miles of territory, with its 10,000 inhabitants, every chance scrap of newspaper, when you picked it up and looked at it, turned out as if by a goblin's trick or a crazy man's hallucination to be the Pittston Par Gazette. For instance, one night when the Congo tom-toms were booming, while hundreds of blacks danced their old African dances and howled, and the white king sat beneath a palm canopy decked with flowers, an old woman from Grand Source offered me a cassava cake wrapped in a torn bit of paper. There was print on it. Through the grease by flicker-ing torchlight, I read how Mrs. Jones and Mrs. Fitty had entertained the ladies, Aid Society of Pittston, with a programme of Welsh folk songs and hymns, how Mrs. Anna Workus had been visiting relatives in Wilkes-Barre. Chapter IV Portrait of a Grosnegre, the leading citizen of La Gonave after Workus and the Queen, is a gros nègre by the name of Constant Polinus. This big Negro, however, is neither big nor black. He is a little nervous wisp of a man, pale mulatto, scarcely 5 feet tall, thin, small-boned, with tiny hands and feet. His only obvious virile feature is his long black moustaches. In physiognomy he is a bit like a rice-fed mandarin. He usually dresses in khaki, with leather leggings which he taps with a bone-handled riding crop. He is a great deal on horseback. His plantation, called Dernier Marque, is between the mountains at the head of the plain Mapu, overlooking his extensive cotton fields. It is about 3 miles beyond Bois Noir. Since I had wanted to remain in the interior of the island for a longer time than Workus could spare from his duties, he had asked Paulinus to put me up and take care of me. We had hunted together. Constant was an ardent supporter of Workus and the Workus regime, so I was welcomed and made to feel at home. Paulinus was not a native of La Gonave. He had come over from the mainland a decade ago and was now chief tax collector for the island. His habitation is a group of the usual mud-walled, earth-floored, straw-roofed houses, but inside the main house is a big 4-poster mahogany bed, brought over years ago from Maragon. It is the only bed on La Gonave. All Haitian peasants sleep habitually on thick straw-woven or grass-woven mats, which lie all day outdoors in the sun and are taken into the house at night. They are sanitary and comfortable. 204 trails winding Workus has iron cots. Natives come from miles around to see Paulinus's bed. He also has a dining room table, a metal washstand with a mirror. But the proudest of all his possessions is pretty mulatto Julie with her 3-year-old baby Marion. This Eham Julie, called Madame Paulinus, is in reality his concubine. He would gladly marry her, but he left a church wife over in Port-au-Prince. Julie is a peasant, but she has small, delicately formed wrists and ankles, wavy, glossy hair. He imported Julie along with the mahogany bed from the mainland. She wears peasant dress, a single, clean, faded shift with no other garments beneath it, and goes bare-legged in flat leather sandals. But she has also a store dress, 1 pair of silk stockings, and a pair of little French shoes with high heels which hang on a conspicuous peg in the living room of the Kale, and are admired by visitors. This special finery she dons only for rare descents on donkey-back to Pointe Raquette or Ants, but around the house daily she wears elaborate earrings and flaming, gorgeous headcloths of brilliant sapphire blue or red. She wears also occasionally a sort of howling purple, one that would kill any white skin, but which, with her rich mulatto cheeks, is as effective as something from an Egyptian fresco. And it is difficult to imagine any white baby, naked in the sunshine, half so lovely as is Julie's little golden-skinned Marion, when an old black woman servant bathes her every morning in a wooden trough. Marion's ears are already pierced, and tiny gold rings dangle. Her head is tied in a Lilliputian bandana of soft pastel reds and blues like a scrap of a faded paisley shawl. She is naked all day long and crawls about the habitation yard. She is beginning to try to walk. She has no fear of donkeys or horses. A pig knocks her over and she laughs. The larger animals are careful not to step on her, but during midday hours servants must watch to make sure she stays in the shade. The place is overrun with old crones who do the portrait of a grosnegre, 205 cooking and washing, kids who sweep with besoms. Julie takes no part in the household work except to make coffee, which is a ceremony. Julie regards Paulinus as a superior being. He has money and a pearl-handled pistol, and sometimes wears a collar and necktie. The peasants who come to pay their taxes say, Oz, MCV asterisk le co 7 in Petroller, and when they call her Madame la Comptroller she beams. Paulinus is an amiable martinet. He is good-natured, sly, often amusing, but he has a fiery, quick temper which everybody fears. He sometimes has trouble with peasants who come telling lies about the number of their cultivated acres. Only land under actual cultivation is taxed. It is amusing to see him curse and push and sometimes vigorously kick this or that hulking giant of a black who could break him like a match between 2 fingers. Once I saw him lay a broom handle vigorously over Julie's shoulders, and he told me he had to whip her once or twice a year. But usually he is amiable, gentle, charming. Nevertheless, all the peasants hold him in wholesome fear. The truth about this little wisp of a Paulinus is that he is a killer, a born killer, and you can read it in his eyes. There are men like that. I do not mean that there is any criminal tendency in Paulinus. He is a law-abiding, peace-loving man. I think I can illustrate what I mean. Some years ago Paulinus insisted on having a survey made of a certain disputed cultivated tract, which he believed the owners had been returning at less than its true acreage. The clan, who were bad Negroes in a remote district, sent word that if he persisted they would make away with him or drive him off the island. In the feud which followed, they had killed Constance's own brother, Ludovic. 15 of them came one night to Constance's house, this same house where I was now staying. 4 of them forced their way in through the door. 3 of them had machetes and 1 had a rifle. Constant remained seated, quiet as a mouse. They told him 206 trails winding, he'd have to get out, leave the island. The man with the rifle swung it up threateningly to enforce the order. Constant shot him through the head and killed 2 of the others in their tracks. The 4th man and the band outside the door fled. Constant now, at this later time when I was living with him, had few enemies. He was very popular, for he was considered to be just, but he did have 1 or 2 bitter enemies. It was rumoured one day when he and I were at a cockfight that one of these enemies was coming to seek a quarrel. Constant, it happened, was unarmed. The man came. He carried a machete and he was fully twice the weight of Polynice. He swaggered and glared and edged over toward Polynice. The feud was known. The crowd was hushed, watching. Polynice turned his back, and when he turned again he had in his hand an ordinary penknife, whittling a stick. And the look of the killer, the born, natural killer, was in little Polynice's eyes. The man fidgeted and walked away. But this was only one side of Polynice. It was latent. It came seldom to the surface. He was in no sense a bully or a quarrel-seeker. He was popular. He was quick-witted, amusing. His nickname was T. Malice, the Sly One. He was an excellent mentor, guide, and friend for me in studying the intimate social life of this mountainside. He entered into the peasant life. He was himself a peasant, yet he was also capable of seeing it apart, getting a perspective on it. Constant Polynice was a superior man. Polynice was smarter than anybody. Chapter V. Polynice and his white. Constant said it was the little snake that had wriggled across our path. Only a couple of fools, he said, would have gone on to the cockfight on that particular Sunday morning. But I think it was the fault of the airplane that dropped bonbons for Julie. Of course, Constant and I both had it coming to us. He had been giving me lessons for some time past, and I had proven a fairly apt pupil. We had been winning steadily. He was proud of me, and I am afraid we had begun to strut and crow as vainly as any of the silly roosters. It hadn't been always merely luck either, nor had it always been the superior fighting quality of Constant's birds. It isn't always what's hatched out of an egg that counts in these Haitian cockfights. We had been sitting up nights. There had been the problem, for instance, of a conspicuous little red cock, Le Rouleur, the roller, so named because he fought in a peculiar way, rolling or weaving. He was deadly, but he might as well have been dead. Osman and the crowd only laughed at us when we offered to match him against cocks almost twice his size. It had taken us a good many nights to work that out. It had involved some amateur plastic surgery which completely changed the appearance of Le Rouleur's comb, and it had involved waiting patiently for a small can of floor stain. We had tried ordinary paint, but it wouldn't work. However, when we finally finished the job, Le Rouleur's own hen mother wouldn't have recognized him. Then we planted him down at Pointe Racket. On market day I bought him for 5 goods. 208 trails winding. Some of the Osman crowd witnessed this transaction, and without suspicion, so it supplied a plausible origin, and we had made a sweet clean-up. Osman himself had dropped nearly 100 goods on the one fight, and from the crowd we had shaken down a whole hatful of small coins. Of course they had all recognized Le Rouleur 30 seconds after he began to fight, and their pained howls of surprise made bedlam. But it was their own sort of a trick, done to a fine turn, and they pounded me on the back while they cursed me and swore revenge. Constant leaped and danced in a frenzy of pride over his white. They used to say always when we appeared, "Here comes Polynice and his white." He tore off my hat and threw it away and kissed me at least 8 times on the top of my head. Osman sent in for a bottle of rum with 3 small glasses and said he wished it was poison. The rivalry between Polynice and Osman was of long years' standing. Polynice tiny and mulatto, Osman big and black, were the 2 gros neggers and largest landholders of the mountain. Osman was another one who wore shoes even on weekdays. The cockfights were at Osman's. They usually lasted all day. 50, 60, sometimes 100 barefoot, blue-overalled Negroes came from up and down the mountain, even from the southern end of the plain Mapu, each with a rooster under his arm, and a trick up his sleeve more often than not. The women came too with their trays of gingerbread, cassava cakes, tobacco, dried herring and raw clarin, which they sold at a half-cent per dram. It was like a little country fair. As I say, Polynice and I had been doing too much strutting. Constant and his white deemed themselves smarter than anybody. Some weeks after our clean-up with Le Rouleur, a man from Bois Noir came to see us with the whispered news that Osman had cooked up a trick to take us. Osman, it seemed, had been across the bay to St. Mark and had picked up there a little Cuban cock, a veritable cock game. Tolynice and his white, 209, which he was planning to run in on us as an ordinary bird. And it was going to be murder. You see, the Haitian cocks generally, though game enough in a sense and pretty good fighting birds, are not game cocks technically. That is to say, they are not generally purebred. In Cuba, cockfighting is a sport of the rich as well as the populace, and special strains of cocks are bred there like race horses in England. But in Haiti it is the sport par excellence of the peasants, and most of the birds are talented barnyard accidents. They are bush leaguers. To run in a Cuban cock on us, therefore, was like slipping a Yankee pitcher into a prep school ball game or a professional prize fighter into an amateur boxing bout. But fortunately we had been warned. The friend who came to tip us off described the bird minutely. It was a medium-sized zinger, which is to say grey-speckled, and had a scar beneath the feathers on the low left side of its neck. Polynus and I were setting traps those days, but we weren't falling into any. The next Saturday when we arrived at the Geiger there, sure enough, tethered inconspicuously at the foot of a coffee bush near Osman's other birds, was the new zinger. There were several others of his cocks we knew well, a black one he called Diabolenduil, the devil in mourning, another big, ungainly, but powerful rooster named Trois Boutons, 3 buttons, and still another called Longa Diole, stick out your beak. Osman putting his big gorilla arm around little mulatto Polynus's shoulder as if they were the friendliest brothers, which in a way they were, said, "I've got a new cock, come see what you think of him," and brazenly, since its gaunt leanness couldn't be disguised, "I bought him because he looks as if he might have a streak of game blood in him, paid 10 goods, haven't seen him fight yet, it's just a chance, so I've named him C'est Putetre, it is perhaps. I thought we might try him out if you've brought something along about his same weight. What do you think of him?" 210 TILS winding Polynus picked up the mysterious stranger and examined him critically, verifying, I noticed, the scar on his neck. "He looks pretty good," said Constant, turning his back and winking at me. "You've named him well," and quickly changing the subject, "I've brought a big rooster along that might make a good match against your Trois Boutons. He's never been in a Geiger, just a barnyard animal and slow, but he's been picking on our small ones, and Julie says I might as well get him killed or teach him to fight. We might try it for, say, 10 goods. Now all this was the simple God's truth, and of no importance. Frequently the fighting for small bets is like that, pure chance for the fun of it. Osman didn't press the matter of the zinger. He came and looked at Constant's new big one, said, "All right. Trois Boutons will kill him, but that's your funeral." It wasn't much of a fight. Trois Boutons would have killed him if he hadn't run squawking out of the ring. We didn't care. And the other battles that day were generally of no importance until an ugly fellow named Luira from the plain Mapu arrived on horseback with a small grey cock named Q, Rake, Torn Tail, which he wanted to fight for big money. Now there are 2 ways of promoting a match at these Geigers. One way is to run your bird down, to say seriously, for instance, "He's old, he probably won't make an interesting fight, but I don't mind losing a few goods for the sake of the sport," or to put the same thing humorously, "I didn't bring him here to fight. I brought him to have him killed because my woman is too lazy to chop off his head at home." The second way to promote a fight is to brag outrageously, to insult and defy the world. Luira took this latter course. He produced a wad of 100 gourds and announced that his cock could whip anything on the island, but that probably nobody here had the guts to match with him, and that sans doubt he'd had his long ride for nothing. And he shook Torn, Polynus and his white, 211 tail scornfully in the faces of Osman and Polynus's white. Polynus had given me a small black cock, a vicious little devil which we thought might do the Bucy-ness, but while we were off discussing our chances and whether to risk it or not, we heard shouts, "Hors la Geigrel, clear the ring," and there were Osman and Luira facing each other defiantly, and the cock in Osman's arms was the mysterious zinger. Apparently Luira had fallen into the trap set for us. We were well satisfied and kept our mouths tight shut, for this Luira was a man neither of us liked. We asked him simply if he cared to place a side bet of 50 goods. He said the 100 was all he'd brought and that Osman had already covered it. Knowing the inside, Constant and I followed that fight with concentrated interest. The zinger won, of course, but it was by no means a massacre. It was a good fight, and there were moments when it seemed to us Luira's cock had a chance. As we walked back up the mountain trail that evening to Constant's habitation, he was unusually silent, but I could tell he was bursting with something. When we came to a big fallen log, he motioned me to sit down with him, and out it came. "We can beat that cock, and we can beat him net without the need of any trick. Osman is a fool." He doesn't know birds as well as I. Every action, every shifting of that battle just now I watched very intelligently. That Zinger is a Cuban cock, but it is an inferior Cuban cock. Osman has let himself be cheated. That cock is swift and keen, but he is not mediant wicked. A great fighting cock must have an evil, wicked heart. It is not sufficient to be merely expert and courageous. We can beat that cock without tricks, with a cock that Osman already knows, and therefore Osman's discomfiture will be the greater. We can beat him with Tribunal. Tribunal was the small black cock which Constant had 212 TILS winding given me, and which we had discussed matching against Luira S on that same day. His name meant courthouse because he was black like a judge in robes, and Constant fancied that his frayed black comb resembled a judge's cap. Tribunal is perhaps a shade less expert than this Zinger, Paulinus continued, but he has the wicked heart. He fights to kill or die. In this case I think he will do both, but I think the Zinger will fall first. It is a certain risk, yes, but we will triumph. And so the venture was decided. It was a week later, on a bright Sunday morning, descending this same mountain trail, that the little green snake wriggled across our path. Constant blamed it all afterward on that little green snake, and it was a bad omen in Haiti. But we had the wicked little killer under Constant's arm, with a sock pulled over its head to keep it from beaking chunks of skin off his hand. We had nearly 700 gourds in our pockets. We were on our way to take Osman. We were smarter than he was, and we kept right on in the face of Providence. Since it was Sunday, there was a mob, and fights were already in progress. Osman, Constant, and I sat on low stools in a corner of the square ring with its palm-thatched canopy upheld by poles, while the crowd squeezed 5 deep around the railings. We had the whole day before us. We were in no hurry to start our own dirty work, and it was a lot of fun to watch the other fights, to offer advice, to bet little sums on the side when we liked the looks of a bird. It was even more fun to watch the arguments and antics which led up to the combats. These peasant Gagers in Haiti are highly democratic. The most ragged and poverty-stricken, but hopeful field hand with a dilapidated rooster, and a few pennies as his total capital, has as much right to his turn in the ring as the gros nègre, the landholder, with his string of favourite cocks and his pockets full of money. Polynice and his white, 213, but first of course he must make his match. To ask for a fight is called manda. This is done in the crowd outside the ring, where men whose cocks are unmatched sit with them tethered. The challenger crouches before the bird he wishes to challenge and places his own before it, held by a string attached to its foot. If the challenged man is interested, the birds are allowed to fly at each other, but jerked back by the strings. Violent disputes arise. Groups collect offering suggestions. It is as exciting as a curb market just before closing. File done, pour de gourds, shouts a chow lenged one finally. File therefore for 2 gourds or whatever sum has been agreed on as the bet. Steel gaffs are unknown in Haiti, but the natural spurs of the bird are pared or filed to needle sharpness just before each combat. Side betting adds to the pandemonium. People rush about, waving small coins or bills, sometimes as little as a single penny, the girls and women too, screaming, 25 centimes on the red, 50 centimes on the speckled one. There are no stakeholders. If you wish to accept one of these bets screamed and held aloft, you simply reach up and seize the money. If you win, you keep it. If you lose, you return it double. Filing finished, the 2 opponents enter the ring with their birds. Each man takes a piece of ginger root, chews it violently, takes a mouthful of rum, then sprays this mixture through his teeth like a laundering Chinaman all over the cock's body, under its wings, in between the feathers, which he ruffles with his fingers. This heats and excites the bird, gives him Dutch courage. Next, each man tastes the bird of his opponent. Sometimes a tricky fellow, sacrificing the lining of his own mouth, has mixed red pepper with the ginger, which is forbidden, or has smeared his bird with a caustic which will not penetrate its own feathers, but may get in the eyes or beak of the other. Usually one does this tasting by simply tapping the bird here and there, and tasting one's own fingertips, but if there is reason to be 214 TILS winding suspicious, you lick him over with your tongue. Each man watches every move of the other, hugging his own bird jealously, reluctantly permitting him to be touched. Even if the best of friends, they are noisy, quarrelsome, and seem angry. When the combat begins, the 2 owners remain in the ring. They are permitted to do anything except touch or obstruct the birds. As the battle progresses, they gesticulate, crouch and leap about, shout, scream, plead, weep, curse, beat their own breasts and Mother Earth. The crowd also shouts and screams while blood and feathers wily. The Haitian cocks usually begin by leaping at and over one another, each seeking to use its spurs in the classic manner, and occasionally a fight ends quickly with a clean spur thrust, but ordinarily they soon give up these classic gladiatorial tactics and fight it out with their beaks. Battles to the death are therefore unusual. More often one bird finally turns tail and runs while the other, after pursuing him 2 or 3 times around the ring, stops, struts and crows shrilly in victory. Occasionally there is something grand about this crowing, a thrill in it like brazen bugles. I have seen a cock flap its wings, lift its head to the sky, and shrill its paean of triumph, only to fall dead a moment later in the dust beside its conquered enemy. So all in all, it was very exciting and interesting that Sunday morning at Osmond's Geiger, and because of all the noisy shouting, no one heard the distant droning of the airplane. It came roaring down and circled so low that I could recognize Captain Presley, who is now flight commander of the Marine Corps field at Port-au-Prince, and all of us could recognize Workus, waving his arm and grinning. It was evident they were going to drop something for us. Workus knew we'd probably be